Driving through Taos, New Mexico, in March is usually breathtaking. The snow-dusted mountains against the endless sky, the way the light breaks through the clouds. It's a photographer's dream. That's why I was out there, despite the forecast warning of a snowstorm. I'd done this kind of thing before. Hop in my car, chase a scenic spot, and snap some shots. This time, I was hoping to capture the dramatic contrast of the storm rolling in over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The roads were already getting slippery when I turned onto a winding back road that hugged the mountain's edge. It wasn't part of my original plan, but I'd seen a promising view and couldn't resist. The problem with chasing the perfect shot is that you don't always think about practicalities, like whether the road you're on will still be passable in an hour. And as the snow started falling harder, that decision came back to bite me. The snow was relentless, thick flakes sticking to my windshield faster than my wipers could clear them. The road narrowed, flanked by steep drop-offs on one side and towering evergreens on the other. I debated turning around, but when I tried to find a spot to do so, my tires hit a patch of ice hidden beneath a snow drift. The car slid sideways, and before I could react, I felt the crunch of snow swallowing my wheels. I was stuck. I tried everything. Rocking the car, spinning the wheels, even shoveling with my hands, but it was no use. The snow had me firmly in its grip. Frustrated and a little nervous, I climbed back into the car and checked my phone. No signal, of course. Still, I wasn't panicking yet. I had a full tank of gas, blankets, and snacks. Worst case, I'd have to wait it out until someone came along. About an hour later, headlights cut through the swirling snow behind me. I felt a much-needed sense of relief as a pickup truck pulled up and stopped a few feet away. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was bundled up in a thick jacket and beanie. "You all right there?" he called out. I cracked my window. "Yeah, just stuck. I was hoping someone might come by." He nodded slowly, taking a step closer. "I can give you a ride to town. It's a ways back, though. You sure you want to stay out here in the storm?" His tone wasn't exactly menacing, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he lingered on the words, like he was testing how desperate I was. Or maybe it was the way he kept looking at my car, like he was more interested in it than in me. "I'm okay, thanks. I'll wait here. I'm sure the storm will pass soon." He studied me for a moment. "Storm's only getting worse," he said. "Could be all night before anyone else comes by." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "I'll take my chances." He stood there for a long beat, the snow piling on his shoulders. Then he nodded once, almost to himself, and said, "Suit yourself," but he didn't leave. Instead of climbing back into his truck, he walked around my car. At first, I thought he was just inspecting it, maybe trying to decide if he could tow me out. But then he circled again, slow this time, his hand brushing against the car's hood, like he was marking his territory. I reached for the lock button and double-checked every door, just in case. Finally, he stopped near my window and leaned down. His face was uncomfortably close. "You sure you don't want to ride?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. I didn't answer, just stared straight ahead. After a moment, he chuckled, a low, humorless sound, and walked back to his truck. I watched in the rearview mirror as he climbed in and started to reverse. My tension eased as the headlights disappeared into the storm. But then they stopped. The truck didn't drive away. Instead, it sat there, idling, just a few feet behind me. Every few minutes, the engine would rev, like the driver was impatient, but he never moved. I turned off my own headlights, hoping he'd think I was asleep or uninterested in whatever game he was playing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still the truck didn't budge. My fingers hovered over my phone, useless as it was without service. I considered making a run for it, but the thought of leaving my car and facing him in the open was even more terrifying. At some point during the night, the truck finally left. I didn't see it go. I must have drifted off for a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the headlights were gone, and the storm had died down. A faint gray light seeped through the clouds, signaling dawn. I managed to inch my way out of the snowdrift. My legs were stiff, but I drove back to town. At a diner, I told the waitress what had happened. Her face paled as she leaned in closer. "You're lucky," she said. "There've been reports about a truck like that. Guy's been stopping stranded drivers, trying to get them into his vehicle. No one knows what he's after, but it's nothing good." The thought made my stomach turn. What would have happened if I had accepted his offer? Or if I hadn't locked my doors? After that, I got rid of my car and opted for a 4x4 equipped with mud tires, a portable shovel, and a satellite phone. I still love the thrill of chasing a storm for the perfect shot, but I'm more cautious now. Because if there's one thing that night taught me, it's that the snow isn't the only thing hiding on those mountain roads. Duluth winters were brutal, sure, but for an avid ice fisherman like me, they were also a playground. There was something deeply satisfying about braving the elements, cutting a hole in the ice, and waiting patiently for that tug on the line. Nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of the ice beneath you. Growing up, my dad and I would brave the bitter Minnesota winters to fish together, his old thermos of coffee steaming between us. Even after he passed, ice fishing became my way of feeling close to him. That's what brought me to the lake that day. It had been a tough week at work. Tight deadlines, endless emails, and the kind of stress that sticks with you. The forecast predicted a blizzard, but I wasn't worried. The ice was thick, solid enough to hold trucks, let alone me and my gear. By the time I arrived, the snow was coming down hard. Visibility was maybe 20 feet tops. The wind howled as I hauled my sled onto the ice, the sharp cold cutting through my gloves. It was the kind of weather most people would avoid, but for me it was perfect. No crowds, no distractions, just me and the lake. After drilling my holes and setting up my shack, I settled in. The propane heater hummed softly, warming the space as I baited my line. The storm outside made everything feel even more isolated. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. That peace didn't last long. About an hour in, I noticed something through the small window of the shack. A dark figure stood in the distance, through the swirling snow. I could just make out the outline of a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. At first, I thought it might be another fisherman, but as I squinted through the frost-covered window, I realized there hadn't been any other vehicles in the lot. Whoever he was, he'd gotten there on foot. Maybe he was just checking the ice. Maybe he didn't have a shack and was out braving the elements. Still, there was something about the way he stood there that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I looked away for a moment, focusing on my line. When I looked back, he was gone. The wind howled louder, rattling the walls of the shack. I told myself I was being irrational. The storm was playing tricks on my eyes, nothing more. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't convince myself I was the only one there. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps crunching on the ice, stopping just outside the shack. I reached for the zipper, pulling it open just enough to peek out. He was there, tall, bundled in a heavy coat and hat, his face mostly hidden by a scarf. He stood a few feet away, his breath visible in the freezing air. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice deep and rough. I was caught off guard. "What?" I said, not sure what he meant. "The ice," he said, gesturing toward the lake. "It's not safe." I frowned, looking down at the holes I'd drilled. The ice was at least 10 inches thick, plenty safe for fishing. "It's solid," I said. "Not today," he replied. There was something about his tone that sent a chill through me, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his words. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was warning me. Before I could respond, he turned and started walking away. "Hey!" I called after him. Wait, he didn't stop. Within seconds, he disappeared into the storm, leaving me standing there, confused and uneasy. I went back inside, but I couldn't focus. His words kept replaying in my head. What did he mean, not today? The ice was fine, wasn't it? That's when I heard it, a loud, echoing crack. I jumped to my feet. The ice groaned beneath me, loud. I grabbed my gear and bolted out of the shack, the snow whipping against my face. The cracks grew louder, spreading like spider webs across the ice. The ground beneath me shifted, and I nearly lost my footing. I ran as fast as I could, my boots slipping on the slick surface. Then, the ice gave way with a deafening crash. My shack tilted to one side, sinking into the freezing water. I didn't stop running until I reached solid ground, my chest heaving and my legs trembling. I turned back to the lake, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The shack was gone, swallowed by the icy water. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Out on the ice, where I'd seen the man, there was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no sign he'd ever been there. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty lake. Who was he? How did he know the ice wasn't safe? And where had he gone? When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked around, but no one else had been out on the lake that day. A buddy of mine mentioned local legends about spirits warning people of danger, but I wasn't sure I believed that. All I know is that I haven't been back to that lake since. Maybe someday I will, but for now, I'm sticking to solid ground. When you spend most of your days on bustling job sites, surrounded by the noises of power tools and the chatter of coworkers, you start to appreciate the rare moments of quiet. Building houses with a crew is rewarding, sure, but from time to time, you need some quiet time. That's probably why I didn't think twice about booking a remote cabin on Mount Hood for a long weekend. I needed a break from the constant noise, both literal and figurative, of my job. A snowstorm had been forecasted, but that just made it more appealing. A cozy cabin, a warm fire, and the sound of snow piling up outside. Perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the first flakes started to fall. The driveway hadn't been plowed in who knows how long, so I had to park a little way down the road and trudge up with my gear. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, and the whole place was beautiful. The key had been left in a lockbox by the door. When I stepped inside, it was colder than I expected. The heating was on, but it was faint, probably a setting the rental company kept to save energy. I dropped my bags in the living room, flicked on a few lights, and immediately started a fire in the wood stove to warm the place up. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. There were dirty dishes stacked in the sink, a couple of mugs, a plate, and a pan with dried up grease. I frowned, thinking maybe the cleaning crew had been rushed or hadn't made it out because of the snow. Not a great start, but whatever, I wasn't going to let a few dishes ruin my weekend. I washed them quickly and moved on, but the weirdness didn't stop there. When I went to the bedroom to unpack, I noticed the bed looked off. The blanket and sheets were rumpled, and the pillow was indented, like someone had just been lying there. I leaned closer and pressed my hand to the mattress. It was warm. Now, I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions, but I'd be lying if I said that didn't put me on edge. Still, I told myself it was probably just residual warmth from the heating system. I shook it off, put my stuff away, and decided to settle in. The evening passed perfectly. I cooked dinner, sipped on a whiskey by the fire, and lost myself in a book I'd brought along. Outside, the snowstorm picked up, blanketing the woods in white and muffling every sound except the wind. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The cabin was small, so I double-checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. Satisfied, I crawled into bed and turned off the light. Somewhere around midnight, I started hearing faint noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the snow shifting on the roof, but then there was a soft creak, like a floorboard groaning under weight. I sat up, but the sound didn't come again. It's an old cabin, I muttered to myself. Wood expands, things shift. Relax. Still, I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and gave the cabin a quick once-over. Nothing. The doors were still locked, the windows secure, and the snow outside was undisturbed. So I went back to bed and eventually drifted off. When I woke the next morning, the storm had passed. I brewed a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch to take in the view. That's when I saw the footprints. They started at the back door, clear and distinct, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. My stomach tightened. I set my coffee down and walked around to get a better look. The prints were fresh, crisp edges untouched by snowfall. They went straight from the back door to the woods, disappearing into the trees. And then it hit me. The faint noises I'd heard during the night. Whoever had left those dirty dishes and the warm bed hadn't left the cabin before I arrived. They'd been hiding somewhere, waiting until I fell asleep to sneak out. I stared at the footprints for what felt like forever, a sick realization settling in. They'd been there, lying low, watching for the right moment to leave. The weird noises I'd brushed off last night weren't the wind or the creaking of an old cabin. They'd been someone moving around. I decided to call the rental company. Their response was immediate. Apologies poured out from the person on the other end of the line, mixed with excuses about how they didn't know anyone had been squatting in the property. They offered me a full refund, practically begged me to leave. But I wasn't about to cut my trip short over this. "I'll stay the last night," I said firmly. There was a pause before the person on the phone hesitantly offered some advice. "All the doors in the cabin have heavy manual locks on the inside," they said. "They can't be opened from the outside. Just lock them all before you go to bed. Okay? That way, even if the person comes back, they won't be able to get in." Okay. It was something. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon securing the place. I checked every door, every window, testing the locks to make sure they worked. The cabin's age worked in my favor. Those heavy-duty manual locks were solid, built to last, and had no way of being picked or tampered with from the outside. By the time I was done, the place felt like a fortress. That night, the wind howled outside and the snowstorm raged on, but the cabin was silent. I sat by the fireplace with a cup of coffee. The thought of a stranger in the cabin stayed with me long after. Where had they been hiding? The attic? The crawl space? Or had they slipped out right under my nose? I didn't sleep much that night. Every so often, I'd hear a noise. A branch snapping outside, the wind rattling a window, and my eyes would dart to the door, expecting to see someone trying to force their way in. But the locks held, and the cabin remained secure. In the morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother calling the rental company again. I'd had enough of their apologies. As I drove down the snowy mountain road, I couldn't help but look in my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the distance, watching me leave. That experience stuck with me. Even now, when I rent cabins, I make sure to inspect every inch of the place before settling in and pay extra attention to any sign that someone might have been there before me. Because the truth is, you can never be too careful. Even in the most remote, peaceful places, you're never really as alone as you think you are.